Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Wednesday, February 5th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you.
It is good to have you here. It is day 488 of the war. Jacob, who just returned from Washington, D.C., covered Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit in the region. There were lots of statements made by President Donald Trump and by the Prime Minister. President Donald Trump said that the U.S. will take over Gaza, level it, and create the Riviera of the Middle East. Those plans and others were discussed during the Netanyahu's visit to the White House on Tuesday. President Trump also referred to the possible annexation of the West Bank to Israel. He signed an order reimposing maximum pressure on Iran and discussed a possible peace deal with Saudi Arabia. Okay, Jacob, where to start? Do you want to start with Gaza and moving Gazans to another country? You were at the White House, you were at some of these press conferences. Tell us what the scene was like, what you were hearing, what really stands out in this day of unending reporting.
So typically, I would say when the President of the United States calls to permanently remove all Palestinians from Gaza, that would be the main news story of the day. But that was just, 4 o'clock. And then there was 6 o'clock when the two of them, Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, take the podium and for this joint press conference where Trump also announces in prepared remarks, mind you, that the U.S. wants to take over Gaza, to control Gaza, and own it for a long-term period. After this clearing out, I think they're offering further details to this plan of trying to just kick out all roughly 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. These, as I mentioned, these are prepared remarks, clearly thought out. And I guess one could argue the goal is to really shake up the negotiation process, shake up the entire region, really, but just specifically the negotiations that between Israel and Hamas that seemed kind of headed toward a collision course. They're just about starting the talks regarding the terms of phase 2 this week. And this phase is expected to see the release of all living hostages that are remaining in exchange for Israel ending the war. But that doesn't jive with Israel's idea of dismantling Hamas and removing Hamas from power. So you have this likely collision course that I guess the U.S. and Israel are looking to shake up and maybe prevent. And this is one idea that Trump has to go about doing that. And I guess the idea is to maybe hope that the U.S. can pressure Hamas the way it's been pressuring Mexico or Canada or Panama or Colombia, which did seem to move after some of the bullying tactics from the Trump administration. But it's kind of unclear how much of a correlation there is between a threat from the U.S. to take over control of Gaza and the decision by Hamas to release hostages or give up its military control of the Strip. I'm not sure if there's a complete correlation there, but I guess what the hope is that either you give this maximalist position, and then if Hamas doesn't agree to it, then you can still meet somewhere halfway, but still further than what the U.S. was going to get before making this very strong position. I guess Hamas is already. I spoke to a senior Arab diplomat today in Washington who said that Hamas
I wanted to ask you. There was a reaction from Hamas already.
Right, Hamas came out against this very quickly. So did the Palestinian Authority's envoy to the UN, which is expected. What was a little bit more surprising was that Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a Trump ally, basically came out. He didn't say completely against it. He said it's an interesting idea and said he still needs to read up about it, but he didn't feel that South Carolinians, i.e. his own constituents, because he's from that state, doesn't see how they would how they would benefit from the U.S. now gaining control of Gaza. And I think he might be an interesting barometer to see how this plan is accepted more broadly. There were other Republicans who very much came out in favor of this, but Lindsey Graham was one who did not right away. Still, though, I think you have this interesting dynamic playing out, and the senior Arab diplomat I spoke with said that Hamas is already willing to seek control of, I guess, nominal control or governing control of Gaza. At least that's what this diplomat says. It's just the issue is that they're not willing to give up their weapons. And obviously that's a red line for Israel. I don't think they want a Hezbollah situation in Gaza where you have basically, even if there's another government in control, be it the PA or someone else, but if Hamas is still there with the weapons, that's all that really matters, and it's able to dictate control behind the scenes. I guess I think basically the scenes coming out of Gaza these past 2 weeks with the hostage releases and seeing how much Hamas is still really in control, I think really maybe shook up also how the Trump administration has been thinking about this and maybe less comfortable with this idea of moving on to a second phase that could leave Hamas in power. And I think that, as we talked about, I think this was just because there was never an alternative advanced by Israel, and Trump doesn't even give any confidence in the Palestinian Authority in his comments to reporters in this Oval Office meeting that took place before the press conference, where he was asked, "Do you think the PA should control Gaza?" And Trump basically says, "Well, they haven't done a very good job to date." I guess referring to the West Bank, and therefore indicating that he wouldn't want them to be in Gaza either. So that's the situation where it's just Hamas right now.
I know Steve Witkoff, the Mideast envoy, was also present, and he also made comments about this. Could you share a little bit of that before we get to some of the other issues?
Sure. So Steve Witkoff spoke to reporters with Mike Waltz, the national security advisor. The two of them addressed reporters outside the White House earlier in the day before all this mishigas started. But the more interesting comments came after the press conference, where he was on Fox News, and he basically justified Trump's approach and said that we really want to give Palestinians a better life, and a better life does not mean you have to stick to a specific piece of land, and that just because you put up a tent in Gaza doesn't mean that you're going to be happy. Basically just justifying this move to try to move them out of Gaza. I think something that Israelis would not necessarily appreciate if it was directed at them, but I think the Trump administration is taking a different approach given the reality on the ground of how just decimated Gaza is. And I think for the first time we saw Witkoff notably criticize Biden's plan that he helped finalize. And he specifically takes issue with the third phase of the deal that Biden put together, and that it envisions a 5-year timeline for the reconstruction of Gaza. And Witkoff, after coming back from visiting Gaza, or he visited Netzarim and Philadelphia corridors last week, he says that what he saw was just an utterly decimated territory, either reinforcing Trump's comments on this or being the one behind Trump's comments on it, but just saying that 5-year timeline is completely unrealistic. We're talking more about 10 to 15 years, because just to clear the rubble is going to take 3 years. And you have 30,000, he claims, unexploded bombs that from Israel during the war that haven't been taken care of, and it's just not safe. And that if this were the U.S., it would never let any U.S. citizens return to territory like this. And I guess this is his way maybe distancing himself from this plan if it goes south, even though he also talks about the desire to move forward through the second stage and get all the hostages out. But it was noteworthy that he made a point of really criticizing for the first time Biden, after kind of talking a lot about how the two administrations, incoming and outgoing, before worked together a lot to get this deal across the finish line.
And finally, let's also look at Trump's discussion of the possible annexation of the West Bank to Israel. You know, he used a pen, notably, on his desk to sort of describe the size of Israel. Tell us about that, that conversation and that discussion.
So that pen display that Trump put on, that was on Monday. It just feels like a lifetime ago. Now we're recording this after.
I'm sure.
Trump was asked again about annexation a couple times throughout the day on Tuesday, and he said during the press conference, notably, that he's going to be making a decision regarding annexation soon. I mean, I guess that could be another form of pressure on Hamas if he threatens to basically give Israel more territory, after saying in this pen presentation that Israel's very small. So I guess the idea of giving them more territory would make it slightly larger. But he also did earlier in the day during the Oval Office, they had two separate basically opportunities for reporters to ask questions. And Trump is, I guess I really do want to stress this point, how refreshing it is to have all this access to the president and the time he gives to reporters is a total 180 from Biden, who was really, I think, shielded by his staff from answering lots of questions. And Trump just took more and more questions throughout more questions arguably during the Oval Office portion than he was taking at the press conference portion, which was just a dizzying experience. I guess it gives us more work to do, and there's just so many things that he says. But it was a remarkable opportunity there. And on earlier in the day about annexation, he specifically says, he was asked about possible settlements in Gaza. And he basically said, look, if I'm telling Palestinians to leave, I'm not going to be supporting Jews or Israelis moving in instead. He still thinks it's too dangerous. So I guess that's something he's not really showing his cards regarding this issue. I think he still wants to figure it out and possibly shift it at the last minute like he's done with the tariffs in Mexico and Canada. But it's something, I guess, when he's talking about in 4 weeks, so be prepared for a major announcement on this issue, which I think a lot of people in Israel will be focusing on. But clearly this whole day was a real shift of focus away from the hostage talks. I think there was a lot of assumptions that Trump would use the opportunity to pressure Netanyahu to agree to the second phase of the deal and basically theoretically end the war in exchange for the remaining hostages, given how important Trump and Witkoff have the importance that the hostages have been to Trump and Witkoff. That was the assumption. But now we're all talking about Gaza and the U.S. theoretically controlling it. We did have Netanyahu agree to send a team to Doha because Witkoff leaned on him. But Netanyahu really is coming out in a much stronger position after this meeting. Even Trump was asked about, you used to have some much more nasty things to say about Netanyahu. It's been an up and down relationship. How do you characterize it? And Trump says, well, actually, it's been mostly up. So that was one thing. And I think this idea just broadly of ousting all Palestinians from Gaza, it gives Netanyahu this lifeline in the fact that he's now able to offer the far right of his coalition something to dangle to make sure that in front of them, to make sure that they stay in the government as they're threatening to leave if he continues the hostage deal. Netanyahu talked about his desire to finish the job again with Hamas, i.e. return to fighting. And you also had Trump talk about how his 2020 peace plan, a lot of things have changed. A lot of people have died is basically what he said. Basically distancing himself from the plan and not necessarily saying that he will be advancing an idea of Palestinian statehood as much as it was constrained in that 2020 plan. Then you had the Saudi normalization that Trump talked about and saying that during the Oval Office that actually he's not getting that Saudis aren't telling him that it's going to be conditioned on a Palestinian state. So all these things you have are just giving Netanyahu more ammo to come to his coalition partners and say, stick around, don't leave right now, regardless of how this hostage deal pans out. So there's a lot of reasons for them to be optimistic, though I would just remind you how one of the last times we had a joint press conference between Netanyahu and Trump, it was in 2020 when they unveiled that peace plan. Israel or the settler movement all assumed that the next day, and Netanyahu even told them that we would be announcing the annexation of the West Bank. That didn't end up happening in the end. That plan was pulled, I guess, away by Jared Kushner at the last minute, and we eventually moved towards the Abraham Accords, and Trump had Netanyahu shelve it. But clearly, a lot of reasons for the Israeli right to be optimistic right now.
Yeah, for sure. And who knows how much they discuss that in their closed room conversations. Let's go to a quick break. When we're back, Jacob will tell us about his exit interview with Israel Ambassador to the U.S., Mike Herzog. So stay with us.
We, the Holocaust survivors, are a rapidly diminishing group. We are in the last moments of being able to share with our young people our first-hand testimonies. Time is rapidly running out. Each year sees smaller numbers of survivors able to accompany students on the March of the Living. Marching with students and survivors from many countries in those terrible places allows our students to learn and understand through stories and eyewitness accounts about our resilience, our strength, and our determination.
This Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Day, many survivors like Ava want to march at the International March of the Living in Auschwitz. They need your help. To sponsor a survivor on the March of the Living, go to motl.org.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, or not much though, really. You had a prolonged interview with Mike Herzog. He's, of course, the Israel ambassador to the U.S. He is also the older brother of Israel's president, Isaac Herzog. And he said some things that you were surprised to hear him say, just generally and in the course of this interview. So give us a little bit of what you heard, and obviously we'll also link to the article in this podcast.
Yes, please do read the article. It was 2 hours of conversation that I basically translated and transcribed. Takes quite a bit of time. So I hope our listeners and our readers will take a look. I do think it's worth it. There's also a transcript.
Sure, they will.
At the bottom of the piece, if you really are wonky enough to be interested in the full conversation. But basically, Michael Herzog is not one known for making headlines. That's how I start the piece, and that's what I do believe, having kind of worked with him or covered him for the past few years in Washington. He's been there for 3 years, and he is someone who has had to work with two governments: the Lapid-Bennett government that appointed him 3 years ago, and then he was asked by Netanyahu to stay on because he was seen as someone that he was very trustworthy, an effective diplomat who knew how to work with the Biden administration, and also someone that Netanyahu knew, because Michael Herzog represented Netanyahu in various negotiations, diplomatic negotiations that Israel took part in, be it with Syria or Jordan or the Palestinians. Michael Herzog was involved in all those different ones. Definitely not as well known, but behind the scenes, a very effective diplomat. At least that's how Netanyahu saw him. And because I guess his role of a diplomat over these years, he's been very careful what to say in public and not been known to make any of the headlines that I thought he made in this interview, be it from criticizing the Biden administration and talking about making this accusation. You could even say conspiratorial, but he gives a lot of evidence, he would say, to back it up, basically saying that while Biden was supportive of Israel and was wanting to see as many weapons as necessary go to Israel, except for this one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, that there were State Department bureaucrats, anonymous people that were hostile to Israel, that he felt were holding up countless shipments and dragging out the process so it would take months on end in order to get key elements that Israel needed to fight against Hamas from the U.S. to Israel. And he goes into detail about this, and because he makes these accusations, I also reached out to some former Biden administration officials in the State Department who very much deny them and argue that he actually just doesn't understand the process. And really what happened in the beginning of the war is that you had what the U.S. decided to do was just fast track everything that was already in the queue, basically. And that once the U.S. finished doing that, there is a whole process of approvals that needs to take place. And that takes much longer. And Israel was just used to that initial stage of approvals and surprised when the next batch of weapons did not come as quickly. So there's the argument. Our readers can decide where they stand on it. But Herzog makes his case in the piece. And obviously it's shocking to see U.S. Former ambassador to the U.S. really criticizing the government he works with. But then you see him do the same thing with Netanyahu as well. He's a little bit less critical, but he definitely criticizes various aspects of his handling of the war, be it from his refusal to advance an alternative to Hamas and refusal also specifically to allow anything that he said even smelled like the Palestinian Authority. He felt like that really limited Israel's options in Gaza. And he also criticizes his handling of the hostage negotiations, doesn't rule out the fact that maybe political considerations were at play when Netanyahu was, I guess, making decisions of when to send negotiating teams or how to negotiate in general. And he's most critical, I think, actually, not of the war, but more so of the judicial overhaul and saying the way that it was advanced by Justice Minister Levin, but also obviously when Netanyahu's blessing was way too far reaching. It created an impression in the U.S. that the shared values that Israel and the U.S. have, that it's the foundation of the relationship, they were basically disappearing. And Israel was not the strong democracy that it touted itself to be. That's the impression that Herzog said came out of the U.S. And he said it made his job much harder. And he also thought it weakened Israel's its deterrence against its enemies and exposed it to the attack that went later ended up taking place. So there was a lot of criticism in both directions that I thought was quite interesting. There were other aspects he talked about. I thought that the protests that have been taking place in front of his house, in front of the embassy, this is something that I know that there's been a lot of frustration and it's been something that's been on top of mind for many of these Israeli officials who've had to deal with it for the past year in Washington. And there had been a decision not to talk about it publicly because they felt that this would add fuel to the fire. And I'm not sure if because Herzog's now leaving office and therefore he doesn't feel like it's as much of an issue, or because the protests have died down, or he felt that it was still important that the public know about this, but he did choose to talk a little bit about it and also made a point to note that it wasn't just the U.S., it wasn't just Israel, but it was also U.S. officials that were being targeted, and not just U.S. officials, but Jewish U.S. officials. And that's, I think, an important criticism that he makes, that clearly there's a little bit, this isn't just about Israel, there's something else behind some of these protests regarding the Gaza war that he pointed out. So there were various other things that I thought were worth highlighting in the interview that I did in the written piece, and I hope that our listeners will take the time to read it. And I'm happy to receive feedback on it.
Words for the wise. Thank you, Jacob, for this very, very wide-ranging update on what's been going on over the last couple of days. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, feel free to email us. Until next time, be well and take care.